Hi, everyone. Welcome to Beyond Screens, our monthly Playable Theatre edition. I am Celia Pearce. I am the co-founder and co-executive director of Playable Theatre and also the co-founder of IndieCade. And we welcome you to the IndieCade channel and are very excited to have you here. For those who haven't been on, watched the show before, Beyond Screens is a show about games beyond screens, with screens, and also outside of them. And we rotate between escape rooms. We start with the theater at the first Wednesday of the month, and then we have escape rooms, we have big games, and then the last Wednesday of the month, we have alt control, and then sometimes if we have an extra day, we'll have a wild card show. So before we start our conversation today, I wanted to announce that the IndieCade Playable Theatre Live Action Game Symposium is going to be happening October 16th and 17th, and we literally put the tickets on sale moments ago. So we'll show the URL at the end for you guys who are interested to come and join us for that, but it's going to be a full day, 24-hour multi-time zone day of conversations and workshops and play shops around the topic of playable theater. So that segues me nicely to our guest today, who will also be involved in that as well. And I want to start by saying how this connection came about, which was that somehow I found out that there was an organization in the UK that was also using the term playable theater, totally independently of us. And we were super excited. And we looked at the website that they had up and we were like, this is really close to our definition. And we thought it was really cool that it was something that people were picking up on their own. And we thought, well, it would be super interesting to have a conversation with these people about what they're doing, what their interests are, and so on. So my guest today is Tom Mansfield from Upstart Theatre. You are the artistic director. Is that your title?
That's right, yeah.
And which is a really interesting group because it's both a theater company and also kind of a, I guess enrichment is the term you guys use in the UK somewhat for this, like an organization that supports the creation of new works by other artists as well as making their own work. And so Tom and I are basically going to have, I think, a pretty fun and lively conversation about playable theater, what it is, what our vision is for the future about it, and so forth. So I want to actually start with a really simple question for you, which is, what is, if I were just a random person and I said to you, what is playable theater? What is your definition of the term?
Well, I'm really glad you asked, Celia, because I've been having this conversation with quite a lot of people in the last sort of year to 18 months.
Yeah.
So just to jump off before getting into that, what you were just saying about finding our website and our definition of playable theatre, I think when we were sort of casting around how to talk about what it is that we do, we definitely came across some of the work that you were doing at Northeastern, and that's been a huge influence on how we talk about our work. But what I would normally say to someone if I just sort of met them casually is that playable theatre is live performance that places the audience's agency at its center. And that's really a kind of a slightly formalized way of saying it's stuff where the audience become the main character. I'm really personally interested in that feeling of walking into a space and as a member of an audience and feeling like I have some control over what's happening. What I love about it is that we're working still, I think, in an environment where, not unreasonably, theatre audiences are used to being audiences. They expect to come in and watch and listen and react, but not interact. And there's been a sort of, obviously over here in the UK, as elsewhere, and certainly in the US, we've had this sort of immersive theatre wave, and there are audiences out there now who are much more up for playing than there once were. But I think even so, there's a really interesting set of challenges and a really interesting set of opportunities around giving people that sort of layer of agency over all the work that they're doing. So Upstart has been around as a theatre company since 2008. we incorporated, we are actually, like some of us who are involved in the company now, were making shows together a little bit before that, but we sort of formally set ourselves up back in 2008, which feels like an awfully long time ago now. And we started life as a, and we started life as a company, as a new writing company. So putting on new plays, single author plays, operating in that kind of classic British tradition of writer writes play, we go into rehearsal, we do the thing, rinse and repeat, go round and round. But then increasingly, I felt like I wanted to find ways to sort of bring together a lot of the things that I'm really interested in that aren't theatre, or that aren't immediately obviously theatre. So, and that's going back to, you know, being a teenager and playing Dungeons and Dragons, it's playing PC strategy games, it's PlayStation, and all those kinds of influences. And about sort of 8 years ago now, I co-founded another company called Oscar Mike with the director James Blakey, and we set ourselves up specifically to make what we then called game theatre. So kind of bringing together, which is a very explicit way of saying, yeah, you know, we have, and we sort of said we wanted to bring together, you know, our favourite things about theatre and our favourite thing about games. And we did that for a good couple of years alongside the Upstart work, and then eventually folded them sort of together. So Upstart was sort of make it, you know, we were doing a bunch of different things. We were doing sort of play type stuff. So always new plays. Like the only thing that's ever linked us sort of from the beginning of time to now is that everything we did was new. It was all new IP. It was newly written. It was newly devised, newly created. So we sort of did the new play stuff. We were doing quite a lot of sort of tech exploration. So we did a good few years ahead of the pandemic, we did a show that took place simultaneously over Skype, if anyone remembers Skype, in London, Munich, and Athens, in which sort of 3 stages were linked by video conferencing, and a few things like that. And then we kind of got to a point last year where every sort of 4 or 5 years we sit down as a company and we try to sort of come up with our business plan for the next few years and really articulate what it is that we do. And this idea of giving the audience agency that comes from a political lens, that is about empowering people and putting them and their experiences at the center. And I think that's applied to all of our work over, you know, the last sort of 13 years. But how do we do that for audiences, for our players, as well as for the artists that we work with? And that's where really talking about us as a company that makes playable theatre. This is a really long answer to your question, by the way. I hope that's all right.
Great. I'm riveted.
The problem is, if I meet someone at a party and they ask me what is playable theatre, I reply at equal length to this, and yeah, it's a problem.
It's the right party. It's
exactly. And also, who's been going to parties in the last 18 months, right? So it's fine. But yeah, so we kind of sat down and said, well, you know, what is it that we're really interested in? We want to put our audiences, our players, in that position where they are making choices that feel of profound importance. In that kind of sort of thinking of what we do as like a rehearsal for political change, as well as a fun and interesting thing in and of itself. And we thought back to the stuff that we made under the sort of Oscar Mike banner and that game theatre kind of banner, and did a bit more kind of thinking about it. And we're sort of talking about, you know, so it's interactive theatre. Well, yeah, but I mean, so's these 18 other things that are definitely not what we do. So that didn't feel right. Game theatre didn't feel quite right either, because it felt so sort of prescriptive. And so we started, there was a meeting I had with a couple of my colleagues at, you know, one of the many Zoom meetings that we've had over the last few years, where I said, okay, so I think it's playable theatre, and I think it's playable because we need to accommodate the people who don't want to play. And I think when we were sort of making games, like sort of focusing on game theatre work, there's a lot of focus on every single participant audience member, player, we use those terms increasingly interchangeably. Every single one of those people has a vital role to play. And that sort of means that if they don't feel confident, and then it will put them off, and either they won't come or they'll come and they'll have a bad time. And there's no point in making theatre that alienates its audience in a non-artistic way, right? So for me, playable theatre, yeah, it puts the audience's agency at its centre, but it also crucially gives you space to sit back and watch if you want to. And it can be as engaging if you're in a space and you're watching this thing happen and you're not interacting with it in any way, shape, or form. It will still go. Of course, what I haven't figured out yet is what happens if nobody interacts with the thing, because then I think you're in trouble. but at least in principle, offering choice that audiences may or may not choose to take. That's the heart of it for me.
I want to put a pin in that because I want to talk about it a little later. The nice thing about your answer is you kind of already covered my first 3 questions. And you also gave me a perfect segue to my next question, which is games and theater. So what's interesting to me about your approach, there are different people come at this from different angles. Game people come at it from the game angle, theater people come at it. You seem to have among the most integrated in terms of like you're already talking about games and you're not game phobic, which is something I've seen happens in some sectors of theater, like the word game just scares the crap out of people. Sort of understandably, because it's problematic in many ways. It's also problematic in the video game industry as well, by the way.
Right.
But I'd love to hear and talk to you a little bit about the connection. Like, where do those two things come together for you? What do they have in common? How are they different? How can they inform each other?
Yeah, that's an enormous question, and I feel like it's probably like that's a life's work to to answer that question. But I can tell you a little bit about where that sits for me. I think it's really interesting what you're saying about people in theatre sometimes feeling a bit wary of game or the term games. I guess, like, for me, obviously sort of getting started as like a sort of amateur theatre person, and then I went to university and studied drama, and then I did a master's in theatre directing. But like, the things that I remember about starting out aren't performing. They're not even improvising. They're playing drama games. And like those really, really simple, like icebreaker type games that you play at the beginning, like zip zap boing. I don't know if that's a thing that you've ever played in the States, but like, passing energy across a circle.
Yeah, I've done it.
Yeah, for sure. And like playground games and all that kind of stuff. And then it's funny, there's always a moment in like a rehearsal, whether it's with students or professionals or sort of community participants, where you're playing a game and everyone's having a really lovely time and the ice is all broken, and then suddenly you do this other thing and like everyone goes and gets their scripts, or we go and we stand in our places and we run the thing, and a lot of what we talk about is or a lot of what people like me as theatre directors talk about is like how to retain that sense of actors playing together in exactly the same way as they have been in the game or the improvisation that you might then do to get them into character or whatever. But when they're in, and now you say what you say, and there's sort of so kind of I've been thinking quite a lot about like how do you keep that sense of the actor playing, even when sooner or later a lot of the show is going to be fixed. And one way that you can keep the actor playing is for the show not to be as fixed. And the best way to do that is to introduce elements of chaos. And the most interesting element of chaos is the audience. But the other thing that sort of I think has probably got me to this place a little bit more than perhaps some other people is when I was studying drama at university, one of my acting tutors was really into transactional analysis. That kind of, I don't know if you've ever come across that, like Eric Byrne games people play kind of thing.
Yeah, my mom is a therapist, so I grew up with that
Right.
reveal.
Right. So I don't have that depth of experience with it, but and I know I think that, you know, like there's obviously a whole academic and psychological discourse around that stuff and its use in therapy that I am in no way qualified to speak about. But it was a really useful thing in thinking about, like, how do you analyze a scene? You know, what game is being played here? What are these characters trying to do? And not sort of getting into, you know, going through the burn books and sort of going, oh, it's definitely this thing, but like trying to put a name to it, to a set of behaviors that we already know. And I guess like and then for me as well, it's sort of that mix of, I think I was saying before about sort of non-theatrical influences on what I was doing. So while I was doing my drama degree, I had a flatmate who I'd do a rehearsal and then I go to the pub or something, and I'd come back and it'd be like midnight and she'd be playing Civilization on my computer. So, I mean, and who doesn't love Civilization? Probably many people, but, you know, definitely
I have a love-hate relationship with it.
I think everybody does. Apart from anything else, it's the world's worst time sink, right? But there was a really interesting thing of going, okay, I could be studying plays right now, or I could be playing games, and yeah. So there's that kind of.
And what was the answer?
Mostly, it was studying plays at that point. I was a pretty obsessive student, but you can always make time in your day, I think, to get a few more turns in or whatever. And like. So even when, you know, sort of a bit later on, I was, you know, traveling around various places to make shows and what have you. And on my laptop, I'd always have something, like probably like Shogun Total War was a big one for quite a long time. Classic, great graphic art, really, really tricksy endgame. Yeah, like I think there's something about sort of always there being games around for me, and that always being and that really being kind of, so computer games, drama games, and sort of back in the past D&D and the odd sort of TTRPG.
D&D, yeah. I thought that was really interesting that was an influence on you.
I mean, I think it was sort of an early thing for me, but I haven't played it properly in absolutely ages. I'm quite I think I'm more into the idea of RPGs than I am into the practice of RPGs. Like it's sort of, it feels like it's a whole other bit of time.
I have to send you a couple of. Have you ever played Fiasco?
No, I've heard of Fiasco. Is that the one with Jenga?
No, there is one with Jenga, but that's not it. Fiasco is it's by Jason Morningstar, and it's essentially like, the idea of it is that at the end of the experience, you will have felt like you've been in a Coen Brothers movie.
Nice.
And the central mechanic is failure. So the whole experience is based on the idea of like, you're constantly doing things and ending up with hijinks going horribly wrong. And it's very elegantly designed. And I think from the perspective of sort of thinking about drama in theater, it's one of my favorite tabletops, because the thing with something like D&D, and I think this is where it, you know, where people are afraid of games, right, is Dungeons and Dragons, just like Boffer LARPs, right? A lot of that it's very mechanic heavy. It's very instrumental. It's not as narratively driven as I think theater wants to be.
Yeah.
So I tend to like, my favorite LARPs and my favorite tabletop games are ones that have a much more lightweight structure that allow for emergent behavior, which is kind of one of my special sauce things.
Totally.
But the game, it's great. No, it's great to hear you talk about games, and I want to loop back around because I want to talk a little bit about agency with you, and like because that was one of the things that resonated when I found your stuff, which is like, agency is a word we both like. That is the central thesis of what we're trying to do, and first of all, it's a word that's extremely common in games. I think less common in theater. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, just first sort of philosophically, like what does agency mean to you as a stance, as a position to take as an artist? And then also a little more specifically, like what kinds of agency, what are some examples of agency that you think are really interesting and powerful?
Yeah. So for me, at least, agency is about the power to make change, like the power to cause change and so in playable theatre terms, that's potentially the power to change the course of a narrative, the power to change the course of a scene, to physically change what's happening in front of you. But the ability to make change, I guess, is the sort of the definitional version of it. And I think, I've touched already on why I think that's important. I think that it's a little bit reductive to say that theatre is a passive medium, in which, in general, you're sort of encouraged to sit back, relax, and watch what's going on. And theatre people, the theatre discourse is full of kind of stuff about like liveness and what do we talk about when we talk about liveness, which is weird because most theatre, especially big budget theatre, happens on rails, and for all the artistry involved, it still might as well be a theme park. And there's nothing wrong with a theme park, but like that's what it is. It's going to happen that way. And I'm really interested in experiences that are unique. There's a great British theatre director called Mike Alfreds, who founded one of our legendary theatre companies, Shared Experience. He has a book that he brought out in about 2010, 2011 called Different Every Night. And he was working on the idea. So they used to make, Shared Experience used to make these kind of epic 12-hour adaptations of novels. If you've ever seen GATS, the elevator repair service show, it's kind of similar kind of methodology. And so in that context, the actor, you're not going to remember 8 hours worth of moves or whatever, like, so it can't be choreographed. And how do you make a virtue out of that? So what Mike's been trying to do for the last 40 odd years is work out a way that, even though the words that the actors speak might be exactly the same, but the way that she says them, or where she's standing when she says them, all those things will be different. And so the feel will be different for the audience. Where I get to with agency is I want to give that level of agency to the audience, like to think about the audience as protagonist. So, for example, in some of the recent things that I've been working on with Upstart, we had a show last year at Vault Festival in London that was called Republic. And this was a show that we kind of imagined as being about democracy. So the audience are cast as the leaders in a newly independent human colony on Mars. And we're under all kinds of threat from Earth. We've got the holdovers of the previous regime, all this kind of stuff. And what are we going to do about it? And the audience are split up into small groups of about 6 to 10. They each represent like one of the cities on Mars, and they all have to make decisions about what's going to happen in their particular city.
Civilization.
I mean, it's so civilization. It kind of is, totally. Except we didn't have it licensed. So,
no, but I mean, I think doing it as a speculative scenario is much better. I mean, Civilization's big flaw, of course, is its colonialistic, morals, which are highly problematic. So I think
also nearly all board games up to about 1995. It's a really interesting thing in the design around that, and that's something that there's another show that we did in sort of 2012, 2014 called The Situation Room, which was about Cold War politics, which is sort of one of the subjects that I'm really just fascinated, like continuously fascinated by. And we made this show in which the audience were cast. This only ever happened in the UK, and all our actors were British, but the audience was split into two halves. One half being on kind of the blue team, so Team USA, and one team being on the side of the Soviet Union. And then they were basically asked through a sort of series of iterating choices what to do about this developing crisis in a fictional country in the Middle East. And I sort of look back on that show now, and I do think, I mean, on the one hand, I feel really glad that we sort of tackled the subject. And on the other hand, like, it was the most sort of, there was no representation of any of the nationalities or ethnicities who would have been involved in it. And it's one reason why we used a kind of fictional composite country as the sort of canvas on which we could play out all of these Cold War stories. And on the other, I do think that the Playable has this incredible potential to that sort of theatre that exists, scripted, let's call it scripted or devised theatre or conventional theatre if we want to, can't really do, which is to actually make the audience go, not just what would you do if you were in that situation, which I guess is the question that all theatre asks, but to actually demand that you decide what you would do in that situation.
And then I will add, though, and I think this is really important, is that then there's a consequence. Yeah. Because I think we probably both experienced participatory theater. If you, I don't know if you've looked at my blog, but I wrote a lengthy rant about voting and kind of the sort of poorly and well executed voting paradigms. And my takeaway from that was really that if there's no consequence of the decision, and this goes back to the agency and what you said about ability to change, like if I'm just voting and then nothing happens or nothing changes, then what is the point? And in a sense, I think if you're doing that, it's almost artistically criminal, because the message you're sending is my vote doesn't matter, which is exactly what we want to push back against, right? I mean, in the US, people 100%. Think that, and so they don't vote, right? So literally, that idea of introducing a level of false agency, to me, is just skip the agency and have conventional theater. Don't fake it,
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it can be really hard to sometimes spot when you're not giving the audience agency because you think you are. And I've definitely done that. I won't bore you with the details of, moments of interaction in Upstart shows that don't work, but there definitely have been, one or two. There was one whole show that we made where there were a couple of sort of branching narrative points, but we'd sort of tried to seed in moments of voting throughout the show, but actually they weren't consequential enough, and they just didn't fly. And they're really frustrating, and they're boring. I think that one reason I like play and playability is because, and this might be a product of just having spent a lot of time making theatre and watching theatre, I get bored quite easily by theatre, and so do lots of other people. Sometimes by things that other people think are really, really good. I'm never bored if you ask me, what should this character do? Even if I don't think that the work is all that great, and not all interactive theatre or playable theatre is necessarily going to be all that. Some of it's going to be awesome, some of it's going to be okay, some of it's going to be bad. That's fine. That's any art form. But it's much harder to be bored when you have agency. And
I also feel like you don't have to give people that much agency for them themselves. I did when I was in the UK a couple of years ago, I did this immersive Great Gatsby thing, and did you go to it?
No.
It was interesting. So it's kind of on multiple levels. There's like a balcony and there's a dance floor, and there were sort of two things interesting. One was that they started the event by teaching everyone how to do the Charleston, which nice. I happen to know quite well because I do a lot of 1920s cosplay and stuff. And then they never asked us to dance again for the rest of the evening, which I thought was absurd. And then the second thing that was interesting was, they break the audience up and shuttle them around into different rooms. It's very much of a sort of a cat herding model of agency. And one of the things they do is they shuttle a bunch of women into the bedroom of Daisy so she can decide what dress she's going to wear to tea with her cousin tomorrow.
Yeah.
And they're showing all these dresses. There's like maybe 20 women in the room. We're just sitting around. They're talking to us like we're there, but they never ask our opinion about which dress she should wear. And I thought, how stupidly easy it would be to just go, what do you think? Which of these 4 dresses should she wear? And then we would get to see that dress in the scene.
Yeah. And it's not like that's making a huge change, right? But it's making enough of a change that it's interesting. It
would be super satisfying as an audience member to see the Daisy wearing the costume that you picked. Like, to me as a woman, especially because they set it up as the bourgeois and this whole thing. And I thought, why didn't I just do that? It's so easy to do. So, and that has to go back to this thing about the sort of the fear of the audience or the fear of the player, in a way of you don't want to hand over your agency as an artist, right, But to me, that is a craft. Like how much agency you give the audience is an artistic decision and a craft.
100%. Yeah, I can agree more. And I think that's why, I mean, to be frank, I find a lot of sort of, you know, what's talked about as immersive theatre, like not terribly. Like, I think it's not even that I'm not particularly interested, although I'm not particularly interested in it. I don't think that's why I don't think it's immersive. I think, you know, it's as immersive. What you're describing with the Great Gatsby thing is it's as immersive as watching a play, which is engaging and exciting, could be beautifully performed, and you know, it's the Great Gatsby. Like, there's some great content there, and it's going to work. But you're not part of the world, and I'm interested. I'm really interested in how, as an audience, you feel part of what's happening and responsible for what's happening. And
so
the Daisy dress thing.
Yeah, the promenade theater model, the way I describe it, and I love that there's, like, I like to say that that's a term for a genre. It is what it is. It's not interactive, right?
Yeah.
I like to, the way that I characterize it is that there is a fourth wall. It's just three-dimensional.
Yeah.
So you still can't, you're like you said, you're not part of the world. You can't permeate the boundary around the actors. And even in, like, when I first went to see Sleep No More, watching the audience members with their masks sort of step away from the actors as they moved through, as if there was this invisible shield, you know, like a force field around the actors. Like, people understood that they were supposed to get out of the way when the actors came through, which I thought was very interesting. But what it also told me was that the fourth wall is also kind of a psychological thing, right? It's not just a physical proscenium, it's a sort of mental proscenium in a way.
No, it's part of the social contract of going to the theatre, is that you know, if you're a regular theatre goer, you expect the fourth wall to exist, and that fourth wall exists if there isn't a proscenium arch, if you're in a thrust setting when you've got an audience on three sides, if you're in a traverse setting and you can literally see the audience on the other side, you still don't, you know, you don't expect to communicate
into the world in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And that's great. And actually, one of the things that I like to trade on a little bit, and me and the Upstart crew like to trade, especially James Blakey and I. So James and I made the Situation Rooms together. We really love trading on moments where the audience think the fourth wall is up, and then we take it down. Those are really fun, and sort of giving people agency without them necessarily realizing it. I'm not completely sure of the ethics of this, but it's, I sort of figure if you're coming to a Playable Theatre show, you're going to expect that it's going to happen to you sooner or later. So there's a moment where early on in Situation Room, in the original version, there's a moment where one of the actors turns around, who's playing the kind of effectively like the head of the CIA, turns around to the audience and asks if anyone would like a scotch. And someone will always put their hand up quite tentatively at first, and they'll be like, yeah, I want a scotch. And they'll be invited to come onto the stage and sit in a chair. And you can always see them feeling a bit like a bit hesitant, but then they sit down, and the actor Simon goes to a filing cabinet. He pulls out some glasses and a bottle of like really nice scotch. We've got a good scotch budget. Pours that person a drink. Takes a step back and goes, Mr. President, the situation is this, and we're into like the show. And what's really fun about that is we've rewarded them for something that they haven't done yet, and they always, like, we've never had someone come to it. Like, we do a lot of like checking in with audience afterwards, as you can imagine, and they always enjoy that moment. They feel weird about it. But also, like, in the sort of pre-show, you know, there's always bits where actors are talking to them. There's bits where we play like a silly warm-up, basically a silly warm-up game at the beginning of the show with the audience. So everyone's kind of, they know that they're going to do something, but that person doesn't know they're going to get that thing. And it is a sort of, and there's a jarringness to that probably, to be honest, if I was making the show now, I probably wouldn't do it. but it really works, and it
Oh,
works theatrically because it's a focus pull, right?
So good. No, because I think the other thing that's really interesting that it does as a message, right? Again, we talked a little bit before we came on about sort of the politics of agency, which I feel like we both also share this idea that there's a sort of like an ethical imperative in a way to exploring agency, which is letting them know that like the president is a person,
yeah,
right, who has to make really big decisions, and how we're all just that one step away from being a person who has to make big decisions, right? So I think it's very powerful because it puts you into this idea of like, oh, that could be me making that decision, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of
that
thought is what underpins the whole show. Like the whole idea is that like these sort of life or death decisions, as we're seeing, we have seen in, like, let's not get into the last month, but yeah, like, oh my god, and just sort of looking at those decisions the decisions that lead to what we're seeing are being made by real people who they're different than our audience in power and status, but yeah, they're humans, exactly. Like, and how do we humanize those moments of decision? How do we get onto that? We were talking about agency, right, and the fourth wall, and that kind of feel. And so, from a theatrical standpoint, that moment's effective because the rules of what's happening on stage are seen to shift. That's really exciting for audiences. People love that moment, and normally, like, it's it's something that you normally do to a character, like. Classic sort of dramaturgy is like you give your character something and then the world changes in some way, and that's like Aristotle talked about that in 2300 300 BC, 2300 years ago. He's going like, okay, change to the opposite in the action being performed. This person thinks they're an audience member in the theatre. No, they're John F. Kennedy, and they don't, they are just an ordinary person. They could be anybody, but for 5 minutes they're JFK. Like, and very specifically, they're JFK. We put in loads of jokes about, like, playing golf with Bobby and, going to the cinema with Jackie later and all kinds of silliness, absolute silliness. But, like, I feel like that moment in a way is sort of, that's kind of the peak of, like, how do you give someone agency? How do you make it theatrically exciting? It's probably not theatrically exciting for that person who's being cast as JFK. It's theatrically exciting for everyone else. So if you haven't volunteered, like, that moment is still, that's a cool moment. And if you volunteer, you are for the next 5 minutes, you're the star of the show. You're the person who makes the decision. And yeah, that's so cool. One way it can work for me. It is that feel of you drop the fourth wall, and then it's really easy to put the fourth wall back up again because you just get an actor to start talking to the audience. And then suddenly you ask them to do something. Like, certainly with our earlier stuff like Sit Room, I think we had to be really clear with, like, now we are asking the audience to do something. Now it's basically a cutscene. Now there's a choice point. Now it's just going to run on rails for a bit. We're going to improvise here. Like that. And so the scripting for that was quite an interesting
so this is a really good segue to something broader that I wanted to talk about, because I think that was a very telling example that you chose that particular thing to talk about, which is, I'm really fascinated by what I call the aesthetic of interactivity, which is, artists have certain aesthetics in different ways. Like, Punch Drunk, they have a certain aesthetic for immersive shows or whatever. There's lots of, my knowledge of theater is not as extensive as yours, but there certainly are directors that everyone goes, oh yes, this is their aesthetic. Sure. But I think that interaction itself has its own aesthetic. So for instance, in Nordic LARP, there's a designer called Nina Essendrop. I don't know if you've heard of her, but she's known for this very specific type of black box, very abstract, very physical, typically no dialogue. If you experience it as a LARP player, what I discovered through working with theater people, but the feeling of the experience is very similar to process theater.
Right.
You're given some parameters. I did a process theater piece with the person that co-founded the Playable Theatre project with me, Danny Snyder-Young. She ran a process theater for a game jam, a process theater piece. And at the end of it, I was like, this is exactly like a Nina and Essendrop LARP. because it gave you physical parameters, and then you had to do certain things sort of procedurally, and then everything came together into a ritual. And I was like, yeah. So I think it kind of leads me to this question, like, how would you describe your interaction aesthetic?
A really good question. I like that. We agreed before we came on stream that we weren't going to discuss any of the questions or answers beforehand.
Correct.
And I like that. But I also like that now. That is a tricky one. I am really interested in narrative, like narrative and character.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and that's probably coming from a sort of English speaking world theatre, scripted theatre background. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of what floats my boat. And so I feel like my personal sort of aesthetic of interaction is choose your own adventure, actually. And that is probably just to sort of drill into that a little bit. There are lots of possible routes you can take through the narrative. There aren't necessarily a load of points where you can do your own bit. Like there's not a lot of space for free form improvisation. Although I'm trying to do more of that because I think it's really cool when other people do it. I just don't think it's not my go-to place personally as a maker. There is a lot of there's more collective choice than individual choice. Like I like voting. I like putting I really love voting. Voting's in everything I do. Like I feel like I need to challenge myself one day to make a show with no voting. Be like, you can't vote with your feet, you can't vote with your hands.
But I think voting, I mean, as I wrote in the article, like to me, voting can be amazing and it can be awful. But that's an aesthetic. Again, it's like an aesthetic decision. Like what does that voting agency give you? What is the payoff of that agency? And if you design that well, you don't have to even give the audience all that much agency, right? But the result of the agency is what makes it satisfying.
Absolutely. And there's something really fun about apparently small choices that have big narrative consequences. Yes. So I am into, I think a lot of what I make, will have kind of, there'll probably be like a geopolitical stake in play. It won't be a sort of, what should this, I don't think I'd ever think of having a scene where Daisy asks you what dress she should wear. Like that scene just wouldn't be in my show. But it probably should be. Do you know what I mean? Like it would be, cut straight to, in fact, it wouldn't be the Great Gatsby at all. But like we go straight to the bit where like Daisy is in Tom's office and she is deciding like, do I stay with my husband or do I leave him? And it's like straight to, I think I have a habit of going straight to like the Act 5 question in Act 1. And that's sort of one of the fun things about Situation Room was like, you can absolutely make that work in that context because it's all these big life or death decisions. So yeah, I think there was something about like audience voting, normally collective voting, but occasionally like one person decides this course. Quite often it's sort of lots of repeating and iterating binary choices that add up to all sorts of potential things.
Yeah.
I am really interested in more ways to explore like audiences finding ways to navigate their own path through the experience. But I don't think it's my go-to place. And that's why when I see other people do it really well, I get really excited. And I'm like, I want to know how to do that. I saw an amazing show last week, just to say, if anyone is in the UK and has a way of getting a ticket for Crisis What Crisis by Parabolic Theatre at the New Diorama Theatre in London, that to me does what I'm talking about better than anything else I've seen, because it's a political show. You're representatives of the Labour Party in 1979, and you're getting on the phone to actors in another room who are playing like trade union leaders and politicians, and your job is basically to convince them to vote to keep the government in power.
Mm.
And so you're not deciding things, you're having to do a quest in order to achieve a thing that then advances the whole cause forward. I love that. I kind of want to do that, but I think it's probably not my go-to sort of sense of the aesthetic.
It's funny because I'm a game designer, I'm very much a systems thinker. And so like the show that I'm working on with Nick O'Leary and Dacha has a voting mechanic, and it's basically it's a carnival. It's basically a carnival that represents broken capitalism. Nice. And it's dysfunctional and messed up, and the voting choices you make change the space, and by changing you change the rules, which changes the space and changes the individual stories. So it's very much about the relationship between systems and stories, like how a system can change a person's life outcome. It's super ambitious and weird, and I think if I didn't have such capable theater people to work with on it, it would be horrible. And also people that have done a lot of work with sort of procedural and playable types of experiences, that when Nick connected me with them, I was like, yeah, these people can totally pull this off. Like it's something that it could be really bad if it wasn't, but it is that idea of like, what is the outcome of the agency? And part of why I wanted the space to change, and I told them, like, to me the space is a character, because I also come from a theme park background and I'm very interested in spatial storytelling. And like one of the things that frustrates me about a lot of immersive theater is that the space is not utilized. Yeah. When you were talking about choose your own adventure, I was also thinking about adventure games, which are very much about like the space has a major role in telling the story even without any characters. And that's what theme park design is, right?
Yeah, right. I never thought of it that way, but of course.
Yeah, so if you do like Pirates of the Caribbean, I mean, there are characters in there, but it's the space, and often empty spaces, that basically tell you, oh, this happened here, right?
Yeah.
There's a whole narrative that you build in your mind, and I think that that's also an interesting way to think about agency too, is like, how am I constructing the story? Like, one thing I thought could be really interesting that I haven't really seen in theater that much is to construct a story non-linearly, which is a device that's used in film a lot, but very seldom in theater. Which, why not? It's so easy to do, right?
Yeah, right. And you kind of see it in experimental shows, but much less so in kind of more mainstream work. And I've never seen it in an
you have the looping thing. So like, to me, the Sleep No More looping thing, where the scenes are kind of being played in a constant loop, is kind of like World of Warcraft, right? Where you go into a scene and like this whole thing plays out, and when you come back 20 minutes later, the scene has restarted and is playing out again exactly as it was before.
Yeah, and that kind of makes sense because it's predicated on the idea that the audience are moving around. But if you, what's interesting to me about that is like, what would happen if you plan for an audience, one audience member, it's probably you or me, let's be honest, but like, who stands in that room and watches 4 different iterations of that scene, and how are those scenes different? And then like, you kind of have this thing of going, okay, how do you as a maker of that kind of experience avoid sort of thinking there is like a preferred order to experience all that stuff in? Like, because all the kind of non-linear theatre, like scripted non-linear theatre, is still linear. It's just the line, because we're always moving forward in time, right? And the audience don't move. But if I'm not being terribly clear, but if the audience are moving around through the space, or they can stay still, or they can see one scene twice and every other scene once, like, what is the value of that repetition? And if you want the audience to be moving around A, B, C, D, E, like, why don't you just have the audience in one place and change the scene in front of them? Like, what's the point of creating that experience?
One of my favorite things about Sleep No More, the first time I saw it was with Stephanie Barish, who's the CEO of IndieCade. And we came out and we got into a lift, and she said, wow, there was so much nudity in that. And I went, wow, I never saw any of that. And we started
Mm.
comparing notes, and what we found was we had each entered these different spaces at different points in the narrative. So like,
Yeah.
I came to the bathtub after all the gory things had happened, and I just found a bathtub full of blood and a bunch of paper lying around. But she had been there when whatever happened there happened.
Yeah.
Right. And so that was interesting to me. I've also thought it would be really interesting to think about giving the audience agency over space. So like
Mm.
moving, closing and opening doors, locking doors,
Yeah.
and sort of deciding where people go. Or one of
Mm.
my friends made this really cool, actually Sam Roberts, who's also part of the IndieCade team, created this audio game, and it was live actors, and the mechanic was, you're basically like a telephone operator, and your job is
Mm.
to connect people to each other, for
That's lovely.
conversations. And what you decide, what connections you decide to make, totally change the outcome of the story. So simple, right?
Yeah.
But again, like really impactful, very, very strong influence on what's going to happen.
Mm.
You can also go the other way, which is the LARP way, which is there is no audience. The actors in the audience are one and the same.
Absolutely.
And then that brings up to me kind of another thing I'm really interested in is, because I have a little bit of a social science head, is how to use social science principles. So like a big anxiety that I find theater people have is like, they don't want to have to train the audience. And I feel like you can use known social situations.
Yeah.
So for instance, Tony and Tina's wedding, which we were talking about before we went on the air, was one of the first participatory immersive theater pieces. And the great thing is, because it's a wedding, it's an Italian-American wedding, it uses both the social setting that everyone is familiar with and the sort of tropes, which is one of the things that's criticized for, is like it's Italian-American stereotypes, right? But it gives the audience something to easily grab onto. And this is a great segue to the other thing I wanted to ask you too, which is, you mentioned something earlier that I think this fits this really well, which is, I read a bunch of papers and articles and reviews of the show, and a common thing that would happen was audience members. So when I don't know if you know this, but when you buy a ticket to Tony and Tina's wedding, what you get is an invitation to the wedding.
Oh, nice.
So they they basically set that, to me, that is audience on-ramping, right? It sets the whole thing up. You know what you're supposed to wear. You know it's going to be, you have to pretend it's real. It sets up all this stuff. But what they found happened was that audience members weren't really given roles per se, but some of them would just adopt them. Yeah. So there's this great account I read of, from, I think it was a theater scholar, talking about sitting at this table where several people at the table were audience members who were trying to fool the other audience members into thinking they were actors.
Right.
But this sort of goes back to this idea of, you mentioned the different levels of participation that people want, right? And I really like the idea, which comes out of game design, right, of different play styles. So you can have a sort of a passive player, and some of the shows I think that I've seen that really are very effective have multiple tiers of engagement. So you could literally just come to the wedding, sit there, eat the food, watch the play, and not really become part of the show at all, except as an extra, essentially.
Yeah.
Or you could start talking to the actors. You could pretend to be the cousin of the bride. There's a bunch of things you could sort of step your way up into more and more engagement. And because the way the play is structured, as the event goes on, people are getting drunker and drunker, and dramas are breaking out amongst the family members. That element of chaos, right, that you're talking about, is built into the story. Like, you're basically saying, okay, things are getting more chaotic, so if you want to jump in there and be part of the fray, go right ahead.
Nice.
I think it's really well structured to allow for that tiered, even within the moment. Like, you could literally in the middle of the show decide you want to be a character, right?
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think there's that extra layer of artistry that you need to apply. Like, how do you design that experience? How do you make it possible for, at any moment in my carefully worked out scene, an audience member could jump up and get involved in this altercation? I don't know why I've gone straight to drunk and punch up. That says terrible things about my opinion of audiences, but like, how
But
do you
that does
navigate?
happen. But
Right.
I think the
Yeah.
example I gave lends itself to that. So I'm not gonna hold you accountable for that.
Sure. But like then there's like there's a directing question, there's a rehearsal question about like, you know, how do we prepare ourselves for that? And one of the things that I really like about working this way, you're consciously asking audiences to make decisions about stuff and get involved in stuff. So what happens when they do? And you can never be prepared for every possible thing that, like, you know, no plan survives contact with the audience at all. And that's beautiful. There's a beauty in that. But it also means that, yeah, like the way that we engage with that mostly is about like, you know, our work is devised normally with the people who are performing it. So those people know the characters better than anybody, certainly better than I do. Like, so anything that they do in character is what the character would do. You don't have that. I think there is a challenge for sort of classically trained actors in doing this kind of work, where you are asked to suddenly turn on a dime because an audience member is doing something, and like, how do you make sure that what the audience is doing is sort of in world? I think is a really interesting.
We talk a lot about diegetics in game design, the idea that things happening within the game world. So like when you're playing a game, how much of the interface is outside of the game world, how much of it is inside. You know, also when you were talking about that, I last year I audited a theater class at Northeastern, just because I'm trying to learn, you know, the vocabulary and sort of understand what some of the friction points are. And I think that, you know, and having done a little theater in high school, admittedly very nominally, I did take improv and stuff. I did a little, you know, I was kind of like heading in the direction of theater and then switched gears. But but an actor, the way actors are typically trained is to memorize words that a writer has written. Right? So you know that, you know, Ibsen has written these beautiful words and you can rely on that. You don't have to think up the words on your own. Your job is to be the vessel of the words and kind of express the words in a very distinctive way for your craft. I may be getting this totally wrong, but this is just my naive take on it.
It's kind of, yeah, that's the basic sort of structure of it. Yeah, I'd have said.
But so if you're asking the actor to also write the play while they're performing it, that's a lot of heavy lifting. I recognize that that's a lot of heavy lifting for an actor. And improv theater, I also took an improv class, and one of the things, having done a lot of LARPing, I took the improv class, and at the end of the class, I said to the teacher, I said, I find this really hard because I'm used to having something to hang a character on. Even if you just give me a little card with 3 words on it, I can, you know, grow that into a very, very full character. But to just have to stand up in front of an audience and spontaneously do something without any prior scaffolding is really hard.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, you know, there's a sort of middle ground between the sort of improv world and the sort of, you know, Chekhov, Ibsen, Shakespeare, canonical stuff, which is the one of devised theatre. And I guess that's been part of the journey that I've been on, that Upstart's been on. So creating a show with your performers through a series of, you know, like, a bit of it might be pre-scripted, a lot of it you'll create together during a series of, you know, improvisations or free writing, and then someone, a director or a dramaturg or a playwright, will sort of edit those things together. So the kind of the approach that we take to making often involves quite a lot of that kind of thing. The other thing that I've always been really into is a kind of late period Stanislavski technique called active analysis. And the idea of that, I don't know if you've ever come across it, but so it's something that he kind of came up with, like, right towards the end of his working life, where he'd spend he's known as, you know, you probably know, for the sort of Stanislavski system, or the method, and that historically began with a lot of sort of sitting around tables and analyzing the motivations of characters. You know, what does my character want? What's my objective? What's my goal?
It's almost a cliche at this point.
Yeah,
Motivation.
Exactly, and it's totally a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's like so fundamental to our understanding of what acting is. But kind of later on, he started like, and it's in the earlier books where he's sort of going, you know, you will figure out basically in sort of very analytical, very head-based way what this character wants, and then you get up and you act it. And what he started doing later on was going, okay, we're still going to spend, you know, X number of weeks figuring out like what do these characters want, what's going on in this interaction. But then we do a point where we go, okay, cool. So in these first 4 lines, I want to make you, Celia, I want to make you laugh. And then when I've made you laugh, I want to make you dance with me. And these are the words that Anton Chekhov has written that allow the character to do that. But what you, the actor, are now going to do, and obviously the other character has something that they want as well, it might be something completely different. But you guys are now going to get up and you're going to improvise based on those objectives. And when you've completed objective 1, you move on to objective 2, which is freaking game design, right? Like you've completed your first objective, you move on to your next thing. It's every quest. But so he started basically getting his actors to do this thing, and they'd improvise for months and months and months and months, and then so you do an improvisation based on the objective, then you go back and you sit down on the table, you talk about what you've just done, then you read the scripted version again, and then you go up and you'd re-improvise it, and then you'd analyze it, and then you'd improvise again. And so you get to the point where these actors are arriving at the knowledge of the script, but the theory at least is that they're arriving at kind of from a much more felt place. But the beauty of that kind of thing, and so I end up using that quite a lot when I'm rehearsing with actors for playable work, because we just might not get to the point where we actually write the script, or we might get to the point where eventually we write the script.
Well,
but based on 16 improvisations.
And this is something I actually wrote about years ago, about the idea that, you know, since much of narrative is about people trying to reach objectives, that's kind of that's what the story arc often is.
Yeah.
That's what games are. So if you can align those two ideas, then you sort of solve that problem of, you know, the canonical games and narrative conflict. And this is what I said, you know, in game studies back in the 90s, was that's a false conflict, because they both are about the same thing, which is trying to get your goals or needs met. And I think that by understanding that structural underpinning, it makes it much easier then to sort of connect the two, I think.
Yeah, it's like a fundamental theory of what the job is, you know, like, and it's if what we're going back to sort of something I think I hopefully said earlier, at least, like what we're trying to do is put the audience in the position of the protagonist. And if you're playing the protagonist in the play, you know what your character wants. Like, you know, no actor will go on stage without knowing what their motivation is. Like it's anathema. Like even if they say that, they'll just go up and wing it, like they instinctively know what their character wants to do. And for playable stuff, I really love, like I can't imagine making a playable show in which the audience, who are the players, who are the participants, yada yada, like where they don't know what they want within the first 2 minutes, because you have to have that sense of clear goal, and that might be something that you're working together with everyone else on cooperatively. It might be something that you're working on individually within that, but having that really clear high stakes goals. I mean, it feels so basic, but like I think it's very easy to miss. And like if you go to, I didn't see Sleep No More, but like Mask of the Red Death was the first Punch Drunk show I ever saw, and it was a wonderful show, but I didn't know what I was there to do. You know, like I was there to watch cool stuff happen, basically, and see what I could find, and that's fine. Like that's completely fine. But I wish someone had told me that was what I was there to do first, because I had a better night.
I have two thoughts that are somewhat unrelated, but the first one has to do with that, which is the first time I did Sleep No More in New York, I was basically playing an adventure game for the first 20 minutes. And going through the rooms, opening up suitcases, opening up drawers, and like there wasn't anything there. I was like, wait, why is this suitcase empty? You know, and then I realized, oh, it's a play. There are actors. I should be following them around. Like, and it was like a light bulb went off. Oh, it's a play. like, whoa, it was like an epiphany. But the other thing I was going to say was one of the things about LARPing and why I think LARPing is very helpful is because you almost never do a LARP without having a character goal. Like almost every LARP, no matter whether you have to read 3 cards or 20 pages of stuff, always starts with, I'm here to do this. and that if you just give somebody that, then they'll find their way through your story because they're heading somewhere, even if they take a different path than you choreographed for them.
Completely. And
I sometimes will break LARPs by going, what I'll do is I'll achieve the goal in a weird way that's not forbidden, but that isn't explicit. Like, so I was in this one game where I was supposed to be, it was actually great. It was a steampunk scenario, and I was supposed to be this wealthy industrialist who was going to fund a research project. And there were all these characters there, and they knew there was somebody there that was going to fund the research project, but they didn't know it was me. And what I ended up doing was forcing a couple of these rival groups to get together and do a project collaboratively, which was not forbidden, but was not expected. And it was this kind of emergent behavior that the head guy, the guy who ran it, was like, well, I don't see why not. There's nothing in the script that says you can't do that. But I love that. I love because that it was a robust enough structure that it could withstand that subversion, I think.
Yeah, and it's not subversion. It's just, as you say, it's emergent. It's logical that someone in that world would do that. It doesn't break the world to do it. There's just not a mechanic. There's not a pre-established mechanic that lets you do it.
So I want to, where it's, we can go anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes, but I could just keep talking to you for like 3 hours about this stuff, but I want to tack us a little bit into a little more specificity, because I just love to maybe kind of wrap us up into talking a little bit about the International Playable Theatre Lab, because I think it's really interesting. I'm super excited about. I'm really, really honored that you invited me to be part of it.
Really looking forward to having you.
And I just love to hear, we were talking about this a little bit before as well, about the sort of tension between being an artist and also being a sort of what I consider like a gardener, like somebody who is cultivating other artists. And so this is the cultivating other artists part of what you guys do.
Yeah.
So I'd love you to talk a little bit about, why did you even start this? What is it about? What are you hoping to, what is your motivation? Basically.
Well, we started, so we kind of started getting into supporting and developing new talent, new artists really early on as a company, and actually it comes out of being, first of all, a new writing company. Like, the first thing that you have to do if you're looking for new plays to put on is you got to find the plays. In order to find the plays, you got to go to where the good playwrights are learning their craft, where they're trying things out. And we discovered that there weren't that many opportunities if you're a young writer in sort of 2008, 2009 to get your work on. People need to take a chance on you. You need to get your work on. You need to kind of iterate through like that sort of that Jesse Shell like testing loop, right? If like you see a thing, it maybe works a bit, and so then you write something else, or you make something else that sort of works. So it's kind of in the DNA of us as a company. From way back when, but we started Dare Festival, which is our big sort of flagship UK-based artist development thing, back in 2016. And the idea behind that was to be a platform for emerging performance, like very broadly emerging performance in London, where we pay people to perform, which doesn't necessarily happen with every new talent opportunity. And that's kind of grown to now quite established program where we hook all of our commissioned artists up. We give them a small seed commission to make some work. We hook them up with a mentor who they can talk to about what's happening. We do a series of days and workshops where we sort of explore methodology with them. We do quite a lot of sort of show and tell, where they'll just show us a bit of what they're working on, and everyone will kind of offer feedback and hopefully help the work develop. And as we pivoted towards kind of exclusively making playable work, Dare 5, which was back in February, was the first one that we did where it was all playable throughout the whole festival. It just feels like as a company who is sort of, there's not that many companies who are making this kind of work. And one thing that I think we need is a thriving ecosystem. Like, we need as many people as possible to be making this kind of work, to sort of possibly overextend the gardening metaphor. You know, I want my vegetable patch over there to be looking really good, but in order for that to happen, it'll be even better if my vegetable patch is in the middle of a set of allotments rather than, you know, next to a main road. I'm overextending.
Yeah, you need your
massively.
basil plants to be next to tomato plants.
Exactly. And, you know, I need to be able to turn around to other people, which is why what you're doing with the Playable Theatre Network is so valuable, right? Because people can turn around to each other and go, how are you dealing with this specific thing? And if you're talking about, like, you know, there are any number of really good programs out there for new playwrights now, which is great, but there's not that much opportunity for new makers of playable work.
I mean, even like, I just submitted, I don't know if I'm in, but I submitted for the civilians lab, and most of the stuff they do is not playable. They have produced a couple of things, but mostly it's much more traditional. But I think the other thing that's really important, and why I feel like, why I wanted to, you know, initially want to connect with you, is in the special issue that we did last month for Well Played. In my introduction, I talk about this idea of building a plane while it's in the air.
Yeah.
Like, the reason we need to be a community is because we don't have the conventions. There are all these conventions in theater. Like, we don't even use the same words. Like, we don't even know. Like, promenade theater was a word that came up a lot when I was hanging out in the UK with some theater people, but like, that's the only thing I know is a genre word that everyone understands what it is. Like, we don't know. We don't have those things. And so we need, I think it's important too, because otherwise I have this thing about why reinvent the wheel when you can invent the car. So this is part of why I wanted to introduce LARPers to theater people, because a lot of the things that are vexing theater people have already been solved. You can just use the LARPing technique for it, right? And I think that's part of what my goal is to create a common language, to create a common set of conventions. The other thing we are struggling with here is we don't have an economic model. We don't really know what, you know, I was told when I first started working with theater people that it's not possible in the US to make money off of tickets. And I explained to them that all my game designer friends who were doing participatory theater were making money off of tickets. So I went back to them and I was like, you guys are doing it wrong according to the theater people. Right? So, but at the same time, the people from the game space have no grants. Like, there's literally no grant you can go to fund a playable theater work in the United States right now.
Yeah, right.
So it's just, and also we don't have the sort of culture of benevolent philanthropy that seems, you know, one of the things I really noticed during the pandemic in going to a lot of these online theater things, that I would pop into the space and would look around, and I was always the youngest person there, which in almost every other place I'm the oldest person. And I was like, oh, this is a very older crowd, at least in the US, right? And then you would go on Twitch, and that would be a totally different crowd who probably has never set foot in a theater.
Yeah, totally. I think, you know, the climate here is a little bit different in that, you know, apart from anything else, you know, we still just about have public subsidy for the arts. And Playable Theatre is fundable by the Arts Council. But if I was to set up a games company tomorrow, I don't think we certainly wouldn't be eligible for Arts Council money. There might be some other grants kicking around.
No, but I mean, Niantic is working with Punch Drunk, the makers of Pokemon Go. So like, it's not out of the but but I think, you know, part of it is trying, and also like there's a bunch of people doing pervasive games, which are also playable theater of a sort, but they're not site specific, or they are, but they're over a protracted area or whatever. I mean, I think there's just a lot of interesting things going on.
100%. And it's like we're all in our, you know, and this is a problem, I think, in the arts world generally, where there's a lot of people in their silos. Like, I don't know, I talk to dance people and I mostly don't know what they're talking about. And that's really bad that's mostly on me, to be honest. But I think there is that thing of going, okay, if we think it's worthwhile to build like a vibrant international culture of playable theatre and performance, then we need some shared language, in the same way that like we need the what's my motivation question for playable theatre. I mean, it's probably the same question, right? But like
as an artist, like what is the artist's motivation, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
What are you
even
trying
more
to
than that, we
accomplish?
need like we said earlier, right? Like if you're not an actor, if you've never been to a theatre, it's quite likely that you'll know the sort of semi joke about an actor wanting to know their motivation for everything. Like it's baked in. We all understand what that thing is. And in a way, as makers of playable theatre, we need, it would be really helpful to me if I were to be working with you, say, on something, and we had a mutual, like a set of agreed terms that we didn't have to spend 3 hours talking about at the beginning of the project to make sure we all knew what would happen. So, and like, there's no reason at all, particularly why I or why Upstart should be the people who are setting those terms. But we have kind of got ourselves into a position here in the UK where that's slightly what we're offering to people, which feels like constantly feels incredibly arrogant and a bit silly, but also like it's helpful if someone does it. So we might as well just crack on, you know? So with the Dare Festival thing, like we started a process of kind of running workshops to support our Dare Festival commissioned artists. That's about 6 people. We have now expanded that process out a little bit because of the experience of running workshops on Zoom. Zoom's a problematic medium in lots of ways, but it works and people know how it works. So we now do it. In fact, just today, I should probably plug it. We put online a series of workshops that we're offering for anyone to come and participate in that are exploring various areas of making playable theatre. They're all on the Upstart Theatre website, and they're all pay what you decide. So people can pay anything from, I think, £1 to £10,000. If you've got £10,000, please come along. But that process is where the International Playable Theatre Lab came about as well. Because, you know, in the US, you know, you and the people who you know and are working with are sort of developing a shared like understanding of what we talk about when we talk about playable theatre. We're doing that over here. We're talking to other sort of peer companies like Coney or Fast Familiar or Parabolic who are doing similar sorts of things. But if you go to Mexico, no one would talk about playable theatre, even though they might be doing things that are a little bit like it. And I think that's the really interesting thing. Like you said earlier, you know, like LARP is a little bit like playable theatre. Pervasive games are quite a lot like playable theatre. There's lots of things that are quite a lot like it, and maybe in 30 years we'll all turn around and realize we were all doing the same thing all along, and all these definitions were pointless. But equally, we might go, yeah, you know, we are each making specific, distinct but linked things, and we'll figure that out later.
And also what we call those things, like ARGs, pervasive games, like those are things there weren't words for. Like until Pokemon Go, if you asked me what a pervasive game was, I would have to give you a 10-minute definition.
And
by now everybody,
like, it's that.
Everybody knows what it is. So
100%.
I feel like, I think it is important. I really feel like practices need to, I mean, it's the same thing with indie games, right? Practices need to have a common language, I think, in order to move forward. And also, especially because it's interdisciplinary and people are coming. I mean, you're going to see at the symposium, I have a little exercise, which I'm sort of in the process of turning into a game of language.
Nice.
Where I have people come up with words, and actually one of them today I was messing around with, which is the word generative. That is a word that means something totally different in theater than it does in games. So understanding like what you mean by generative and what I mean by generative is important. Otherwise, we're not having the same conversation. Right?
Yeah, and it's quite possible that we spend a long time working on stuff before we realize that, and that's the real problem.
Exactly.
So yeah, for us, I think that sort of, you know, what we generally call artist development is so about like making sure that so there are other people who can be talking about ideas with, to be honest, like, and therefore making our own shows better. It's also audience development for us. Like if there are other people out there who are making playable work, it's more likely that someone will come to our stuff because they'll have seen something else good that's playable, and that stuff is really important. Like
I
shared
mean, there's an
marketing, to be
audience,
honest,
there's a
is super
fan,
important.
yeah, there's a fan base. Like,
Yeah.
and one of the things we want to do with the Playable Theater group in the US is have a fan community, because like here in Boston has a lot of Playable Theater going on, and most of the shows that people do are packed, and they're packed with the same people. Like those people will go to all the Playable Theater shows, right?
Yeah.
So building that audience, and a lot of those people are gamers. I think that going back to the generational thing, I feel like gamers and also people that come out of sort of fandom and, you know, the Marvel universe and things like that, they need something more out of their theater. I don't think they want to just necessarily sit in a chair and watch people yelling at each other on a stage for 3 hours. Like, I think that they're looking for a little different kind of experience. And when they get it, and part of my contention here is because, at least in Boston, most of, not all, but a good deal of the shows are at least breaking even and paying people to be part of the show, often selling out. There's plenty of room for more. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, and one reason why you're already at that point, right, is there's enough of I'm no economist, right, but like there's enough of a marketplace out there to build demand that then blah blah blah. You know?
It feeds itself. Yeah, exactly. People go, oh, we went to this Playable Theater thing, it was really fun. Oh, let's go to another one sometime, right? So it becomes a thing that people recognize as something fun to do. Like here, there's a couple of groups that do pub crawls. And so that's a format that now people know what it is. When they hear it, they go, oh, a pub crawl, we know what that is. You wear a costume, you play a character, you have a goal, you know, it's a LARP, but it's not in one location. I think we can, part of what I like about this, for me personally, because I started working in video games in the early 80s, the most exciting time to be a part of something is when there's no words for anything.
And feeling like there's no words for anything, so no one set the rules, no one set like the terms of what you can and can't do, and people are into it. But just going back to what you were saying about fandom, I think that's so exciting, like thinking about fandom for live performance, and it's not going to be for like one single company, although there is a Punch Drunk fans. Every conversation about playable and interactive theatre eventually comes back to Punch Drunk. It's kind of annoying.
It is.
But like, you know, there's a Punch Drunk fans Facebook group, and I think I've not seen that for any other theatre company who don't do interactive and playable stuff, right?
Yeah, you know, Dacha has a huge fan base, and when they come on when they've been on my show a couple times, they always bring a bunch of their audience members on to watch the show.
Nice.
Yeah. But I think that you're right. I mean, people get attached to these companies in part because I think the agency. Yeah.
And the kind of, like, going back to that kind of aesthetic of interaction, right? What kind of relationship do you have? You know, when I was sort of starting out, I was also playing in bands and doing that kind of thing. And you know, we were never big, but we had fans. We had people who would come up to any of our gigs who weren't like necessarily into other people's music. And I think from a theatre perspective, that happens as well, but generally it's sort of other people who are interested, like who are so interested in theatre that they probably work in it, right? And like, I really want those people to come to all my stuff. I love them. Like they know stuff. Like there's nothing better than having an audience who really kind of get what you're trying to do. But I'm really interested in how we can develop an audience for playable and interactive work of people who are just like, they're a fan of that in the same way that they're a fan of, Marvel, I think is quite a good example.
Yeah. Or just theater. Like, you know, there are people here that go to all the plays or go to all the operas or whatever. There's going to be a group of people that are going to go to all the playable theater stuff as well, I think.
Yeah. And when we have those people, like, I think that's when the sector is going to kind of kick into overdrive, I think.
Yeah, it's exciting. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about the lab? Anything specific that you think is worth?
So I think it's probably, you know, there's an interesting thing around, there's a few things that we're doing that are quite new. I mean, so Playable Theatre. So we're working with artists in Mexico and in the Republic of North Macedonia. It's all funded by the British Council. I promise we didn't just approach those countries because they both begin with M, but they are countries where we both have where we have partners who we worked with on other things before. And the British Council are really keen to, so their remit is to promote Britain and British culture worldwide. And one thing that we're able to do is sort of,
I'm laughing at that because it's like, for people who are native English speakers, why do you need to do that anymore?
Yeah. I could do you a whole number on like the history of the British Council and why.
And I live in New England.
Yeah. It's hilarious. It's basically, in a way, the British Council, it's go around the world and make sure that people know that we can be the good guys. Honestly, I think that's what the whole kind of like, that's what the British Council does. That's what the Goethe Institute does for Germany. It's kind of, cultural institutes are all about that, right? Sort of promoting the positive aspects of like who we are and who we are now as a country, rather than, like we haven't had red coats for a while,
But the UK is also like in theater in particular, and particularly in this kind of theater, like as I've been going around and like you just rattled off all these people, Fast Familiar and these different groups, but like the UK and particularly London is a place where stuff is happening in this space.
Yeah, totally. And so and I think that's why the British Council is keen to sort of to keep supporting. I think it's really interesting because so a company like Fast Familiar, for example, they'll talk about playable shows, but they won't talk about playable theatre. That's a conversation that I've had with them, with Rachel in particular, one of the lead artists, a couple of times now. It's like, okay, cool. We're sort of talking about the same thing. But going back to the lab, I think that the purpose of the lab really is to bring together a whole bunch of people who are working in that playable theatre space. And so although the artists who we're working with are, for this first instance, they're in Mexico, they're in North Macedonia, it's actually about opportunities to sort of gather all of those bits of information in one place about what playable theatre is. And we're hoping that we'll be able to keep doing it and work in other countries and just kind of keep the whole thing going. It's been made possible, to be honest, by the fact that post-pandemic, everyone has been more open to working online. It has its limitations, obviously, but it's been a really interesting thing going, okay, cool, we can't, there's no way we could have like 10 British artists go to Macedonia or bring 6.
I feel like there was a golden age of arts funding in the UK, because I used to get flown out there all the time for stuff. And you could do like the people had enough money to do that, but nobody has that anymore.
Yeah, pre 08, I think there's a lot more.
Yeah, late
flying
90s.
People around the world. Yeah. Annoyingly, we kind of started the company just as the financial crisis was kicking off, so we never really accessed any of that. But I do think that the value is, there is going to be an international community of artists and makers who are interested in playable performance, and if we can keep those conversations going, that's how the form will develop. Like theatre is a worldwide thing.
I wanted to apply when I saw it. I was like, I want to apply for this, and I went in and I'm like, Mexico and Macedonia, and then you asked me to be involved anyway.
I think you probably know most of the stuff that we're talking about, to be fair, but like there's something really interesting that we're developing this sort of long form workshop program that's dropping. You don't have to go to. You can go to one session. You're basically.
I'm definitely coming because I want to. Because I want to see what you're doing, and I also want to do some things with you jointly.
Yeah, 100%. I'd love that. And I think there's something really interesting in just going. So some of the artists who we've got on the monthly workshop program, some of them are very experienced playable theatre artists. Some are they just made 1 or 2 shows that are kind of in the playable space, but they come from a sort of deep level of experience in making a whole bunch of other things. And so we're kind of keeping this conversation going around what playable theatre is and what it can be is really exciting. And the more, like there's the obsessive people like you and me who are like, this is what we do. But then it's sort of the people who they're game designers or they're theatre makers, but then they make a playable theatre show. And again, I think that's how playable theatre will continue to develop itself and catch on. That feels really important.
Yeah. We see a lot of that at IndieCade. Like for me, one of the big turning points for me about this was when we did in IndieCade 2017, no, 16 was at USC, and the Capital W won the Game Design Award for Hamlet Mobile.
Nice.
And they were like, and it wasn't even really a game per se, but yet it won the award. So I felt like that was a really good sign that this was something that was kind of, that the integration of the two is happening more and more.
Yeah.
I was just checking with Lance to see if we have anybody, any questions from the audience, just in the last few minutes that we have here. I'm not looking at the stream, so Lance, if you have any questions, can you bop them into the Discord? No one has messaged in the chat. That's fine. That happens. Sometimes people just talk. And also the other thing about the show is we have kind of two tiers. We have the live audience members, but then usually multiple more times than that watch the show after. So if we're seeing a small audience, we don't freak out too badly because we know some people are going to watch it later. So, and we should also, by the way, feel free if you want to post it on your guys' site. I think we should probably wrap things up. It was just great. I could talk to you for 5 hours easily.
Same. Thank you so much. It's been so great talking.
I'm so excited that we found each other and that we're joining forces. It's great. It's going to be really fun.
Absolutely.
So I also want to make a plug for literally, tickets went on sale like 15 minutes before we went live for the Playable Theatre, IndieCade Playable Theatre live action game symposium. This is an online symposium. It's really focused on practitioners and playable theater. There's going to be a lot of really interesting people there. And let's see, Tom will be part of it. I don't know if people know Jamie Harper, who's written a lot, and also Jamie's an interesting one because, you know, he was the theater guy who then went and got a degree in game design.
Yeah.
It's like, I love that. And a bunch of other people from different, Capital W is going to be there. I'm in the process of trying to get one of the creative leads from the Niantic Punch Drunk project, which I'm really interested in hearing about. And just kind of an all-star cast of people across LARPs and games and tabletop and theater that are all engaged in this kind of work. So it should be a really fun day. It's October 16th and 17th, but it's because there's multiple time zones. So it'll be 17th for some people, 16th for some people, depending on what time zone you're in. We'll kick up a slide at the end of the show to give everybody a link to where to get tickets. So thank you so much, Tom. It was just a delight speaking with you, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Celia. Catch you soon.